Good afternoon. My name is Bronwyn Wilson, and I'm the director of the UCLA Center for 17th and 18th Century Studies and the William Andrews Clark Memorial Library. As a land-grant institution, UCLA acknowledges the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tovangar, the Los Angeles Basin and South Channel Islands. We're pleased to welcome Dr. Tara Thomas, who recently completed her PhD in literature at UC Santa Cruz. Dr. Thomas is the media manager and education programs assistant at the Dickens Project. She has work in studies in Walter Pater and aestheticism, and an article currently under review at Victorian Poetry. This afternoon, Dr. Thomas will present Philomela at the Fin de Siècle, a paper informed by her Clark Library Fellowship research, which examines Oscar Wilde and Michael Field's engagement with the Philomela myth from Greco-Roman mythology. Dr. Thomas is the first recipient of the Kenneth Karmiole Endowed Graduate Research Fellowship, a one-month fellowship established through the generosity of Kenneth Karmiole. This new fellowship is available to all graduate students for research at the Clark Library using archival and printed book materials on any subject. We look forward to hosting these annual research presentations as a part of this fellowship. We extend our sincere gratitude to Ken, an internationally renowned antiquarian bookseller who has been an avid supporter of the Clark Library for many years. In 2005, he endowed Kenneth Karmiole lecture series on the history, an annual talk focused on the book trade in England and Europe during the 17th and 18th centuries. Thank you, Ken, for creating opportunities to highlight and utilize the actions. Thank you all for being with us today. And now let's turn things.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm just going to share my slides. And I want to start by just thanking Ken for giving me the opportunity to research at the Clark Library, to Bronwyn Wilson and Scott Jacobs for welcoming me to the Clark, and to Jeanette, Eric, Myrna, and everyone else who helped to facilitate my research. So my talk today comes from a larger dissertation project that examines the ways that English decadent authors represented ancient Roman homoeroticism quite differently than that of ancient Greek. My project shows how late Victorian authors and artists engaged with Roman Epicureanism and decadence to prefigure their investment in a more inclusive model of collaboration. There we go. Two of these authors, Oscar Wilde and Michael Field, the Antinese lesbian co-authors, penned queer adaptations of the Philomela myth. This is the myth from Ovid's Metamorphoses, where Tereus, the husband of Philomela's sister Procne, rapes her and cuts out her tongue. The two sisters seek revenge on Tereus by killing his son Itys and forcing Tereus to commit cannibalism. The story concludes with the sisters' transformation into songbirds, pursued by Tereus, who transforms into a hawk or a hoopoe. The question of why Wilde and Michael Field adapt the Philomela myth when Greco-Roman mythology abounds with proto-queer and trans stories is the driving question of this research. Michael Field and Oscar Wilde both adapt the Philomela myth to draw out elements of the story that highlight its queer potentiality. This includes the mythic connection between Philomela and Orpheus after he began practicing same-sex love, and between Philomela and Procne, whose transcendent homosocial love concludes the story. I post that Wilde and Michael Field revise the Philomela myth as an origin story for the self-revelation of one's sexual orientation, for coming out queer in adulthood. Wilde engages with the Philomela myth in the 1880s prior to his relationship with Robbie Ross, and Michael Field adapts the myth in 1901, years after Bradley and Cooper had become a romantic partnership. And while I view both authors as engaging with the story to explore their shared same-sex desire, and also for Michael Field, the transition from familial to romantic bonds, my focus today is primarily on the texts themselves. So my talk will be in 3 parts. I'll begin by showing how Wilde first engages with the Philomela myth in the Burden of Itys, which features Itys as Orpheus' lover. I'll then turn to the Nightingale and the Rose, in which the Nightingale philosophizes about homoerotic platonic love. And lastly, I'll introduce Michael Field's unpublished poetic adaptation of the Philomela myth that depicts a transformation from sisterly to romantic love. Okay, part 1. In his 1881 The Burden of Itys, Wilde invents a new Orphic song where Orpheus, after overhearing Philomela's cry, himself sings of Itys. Wilde innovates the classical connection between the Orpheus and Philomela stories by inserting a new song into the corpus of homoerotic songs Orpheus sings after losing Eurydice and converting to same-sex love. History of sexuality scholars, including Michel Foucault and Heather Love, have tended to focus their attention on Orpheus's eternal mourning for Eurydice as a symbol of queerness. Recently, Jennifer Engelhardt has explored the Orpheus myth as an origin story of Thracian pederasty and adult same-sex desire. In Wilde's scholarship, Jarle Manny has argued that the Ovidian Orpheus is, quote, an archetypal guide not only for Dorian Gray, but for Wilde himself, end quote. As a classically educated homophile, Wilde indeed seems to have recognized the potential within the Orpheus myth. In The Burden of Itys, he engages more concretely with the myth by representationally assuming the role as a homoerotic Orphic poet and naming his same-sex lover as Itys from the Philomela myth. In Wilde's poem, the poet overhears a nightingale song in the Oxford countryside and envisions Philomela singing a requiem over Itys's grave. To develop his own version of the story, he incorporates various aspects from different versions of the Philomela and Orpheus myths. In the Georgics, Virgil draws the connection between Philomela and Orpheus through a simile comparing Orpheus's elegy to Philomela's birdsong. He sings the story about his unsuccessful catabasis to rescue his wife Eurydice, quote, as the nightingale grieving in the poplar shadows laments the loss of her chicks. She weeps all night and repeats her sad song, perched among the branches, filling the place around with mournful cries, end quote. The lesser known geography and writer Pausanias describes a different connection between Orpheus and Philomela. In his version, the nightingale sings over Orpheus's grave after his dismembered head finds its final resting place on Lesbos, the birthplace of Sappho. Over Orpheus's grave, Philomela sings, quote, more sweetly and louder, end quote, than all other nightingales. This version creates a trifecta between 3 of the greatest classical mytho-historic poets, Sappho, Orpheus, and Philomela, and also affiliates the latter with same-sex desire. In Ovid's version, Orpheus rejects heterosexuality after losing Eurydice and instead embraces same-sex love. Wilde writes that Orpheus, quote, set the example for the people of Thrace of giving his love to tender boys and enjoying the springtime and first flower of their youth, end quote. Didactic homoerotic poetry that Ovid embeds within the myth is the means through which Orpheus disseminates this knowledge. Wilde's poem translates Philomela's song, reiterating Ovid's erotic myths over Itys's grave. The poet first sets his gaze on Narcissus, writing, quote, on the clear river's marge Narcissus lies, the tangle of forest in his hair, the silence of the woodland in his eyes, wooing that drifting imagery which is no sooner kissed than broken. He envisions the scene of a same-sex kiss where Narcissus kisses his own image before immediately moving on to describe the queer relationship between Salmachus and Hermaphroditus. He then stops to appreciate Antinous' quote, voluptuous style, smile, end quote, and watches Hyacinth, quote, come through the trees with passion-wearied face, end quote. Wilde incorporates Ovid's queer myths throughout, yet when he turns his attention to Itys, his focus is specifically on the Orpheus myth. In one stanza, the poet provokes the nightingale to continue her song as he strains to conjure to mind the image of Itys. Wilde writes, "Sing on, and I, the dying boy, will see, stain with his purple blood the waxen bell that overweighs the jacinth, and to me, the wretched cyprin, her woe will tell, and I will kiss her mouth and streaming eyes, and lead her to the myrtle hidden grove where Adon lies." In this stanza, Wilde encapsulates Orpheus's songs, which begins with Hyacinth and ends with Venus and Adonis. Singing poetic accounts of Hyacinth and Ganymede, the boy lovers of Apollo and Zeus, is how Orpheus teaches the Thracians about same-sex love. When Wilde writes that the poet will stain with his blood the waxen bell that overweighs the jacinth, he inscribes the Thracian prince Itys as Orpheus's beloved. Through incorporating Itys as another beloved turned flower in Ovid's Metamorphoses, Wilde concretizes Orpheus's same-sex desire and queers the Philomela myth. These lines also encompass the metapoetics of Ovid's Orpheus's verse by transcribing purple blood onto the flower's bloom and ink onto waxen paper. Like the hyacinth whose many petals all form the repeated cry, I, the stanza reverberates with the assonance, and I, eyes, Adon lies. The repetition of I draws attention to the ambivalence of the first line, I, the dying boy, will see, where Wilde's poet insinuates his own identification with, as well as desire for the beloved. Wilde's implicit comparison between the modern and classical homoerotic poet in these lines became a focal point for the Victorian critique of the volume, thanks to Punch magazine. In spite of the general negative reception of the poems, the Burden of Itys was well received. On June 25th of 1881, just weeks after the publication of the first edition, the Punch cartoonist Lindley Samburn satirized Wilde in a cartoon accompanying their review of his collection. The illustrations allude to the Burden of Itys and its depiction of Wilde as a hybrid sunflower poet. Samburn riffs off of Wilde's ambiguous line aligning him with Itys and Hyacinth when he transforms Wilde into the sunflower, an iconic symbol of the aesthetic movement. His initials OW, ow, while typical of a Punch cartoon, also echo the onomatopoeic I that the mythic Hyacinth is said to imitate, in a humorous reference to Punch's negative review of the volume. Punch accuses Wilde of being derivative and tame. The irony of Punch calling the volume tame is notable, since the critique is focalized through the image of Wilde himself as a homoerotic Ovidian sunflower boy. Wilde's Burden concludes with a Gothic image of fleeting silent birds, imitative of Virgil's account of Orpheus's descent to hell. Quote, dim lengthening shadows flit like swallows up the hill, and the silence is so acute that, quote, one might hear the bat's small wing wander and wheel above the pines, end quote. Virgil, by comparison, describes the, quote, phantoms without light as insubstantial shadows, as many as the 1,000 birds that hide among the leaves when the shadows drive them from the hills, end quote. At the end of the poem, then, Wilde returns to the moment of Orpheus's misery from losing Eurydice that marks a turning point in his sexual maturity. It is the moment when he abandons the heterosexual marriage of his young adulthood in favor of same-sex love. By turning to Virgil's scene where Orpheus's lament is compared to that of Philomela, Wilde forges an identification between the two. Through the process of ventriloquizing Philomela's song, Wilde's poet translates familial to homoerotic relations. The aunt and nephew relationship in the original becomes, in Wilde's version, a relationship between poet and beloved. The metamorphosized relationality here echoes Ovid's Philomela's cry that Tereus has confused all natural kinship relations, an impassioned indictment she gives just before Tereus severs her tongue, leaving her voiceless. Wilde's Philomela never articulates, and the poet never attempts to translate her own story of desire and despair. Unifying their voices through the first person plural, the poet expresses their mutual incapacity to express their own tragedies. We, Wilde writes, quote, who by dead voiceless silence strive to heal our two untinted wounds, and do but keep pain barricaded in our hearts and murder pillowed sleep, end quote. They are melancholy figures whose love objects remain ambiguous and who lack the language with which to articulate their desire, instead sublimating it into their storytelling. Interestingly, Wilde rescues Orpheus from a similar predicament. In the Metamorphoses, Orpheus sings songs espousing same-sex love, yet Ovid never incorporates a story featuring Orpheus and a male beloved. Naming Itys as Orpheus's lover revises Ovid to solidify his queerness, and thus insinuates that the poet and Philomela are also queer by proxy. In the poem, Wilde only briefly encapsulates Philomela's own story in order to articulate her reluctance to revisit the origin of her trauma. Wilde writes, quote, poor mourning Philomela, what dost thou fear? Thy sister dost not haunt these fields. Pandion is not here. Here is no cruel lord with murderous blade, no woven web of bloody heraldries. Wilde is more interested in elaborating the connection between Philomela and Orpheus myths through Itys than he is in exploring Philomela's individual story. However, it is perhaps through his invented homoerotic song about Orpheus and Itys that he recognizes the queer potentiality of Philomela herself. The reunion of the swallow and the nightingale at the end of the poem, a pivotal moment of sexual transformation for Orpheus, becomes a transitional moment for the sisters as well. The Gothic haunting of birds, including the swallow and the nightingale, flittering like bats in a darkened sky, evokes the spectral history, nature of queer history, especially queer women's history. Wilde distinguishes between the fear response toward the heteropatriarchal violence that Tereus and Pandion represent, and the haunting that Philomela feels towards Procne. Terry Castle, Elizabeth Freeman, and others have shown how in Western literature, quote, the lesbian remains a kind of ghost effect, elusive, vaporous, difficult to spot, even when she is there in plain sight, end quote. Like Orpheus, Philomela and Procne turn away from heterosexual marriage to homosocial sisterhood in an apparitional state that encodes them as queer women. As a character unjustly punished for other sexual transgressions, and who only ever expresses homosocial love between women, Philomela became a queer figure with whom Wilde increasingly engaged and perhaps identified with as he gained awareness of his own sexual attraction in the 1880s. The Orpheus and Philomela connection reads nicely as symbolic of the alliance between queer men and women authors of the Fin de Siècle. Wilde forges a queer collaboration between Philomela and Orpheus, the latter of whom translates from Latin or birdsong to English, Philomela's story to queer ends, and yet does so in ways that preserve her own song. So to move on to part 2, I'm just going to take a sip of water. So when Wilde revises the Philomela myth, he turns away from the anthropocentrism of poetry to the fairy tale, the fantastic genre that allows birds to be birds and roses roses. It is perhaps the most fitting modern genre through which to adapt Ovid's metamorphic poetry, since it enables Wilde to figure the nightingale as protagonist while also exploring her symbolic theoretical value as a queer artist. The Philomela myth is the most explicit, empathetic, and extensive story about sexual violence and feminist vengeance in Ovid's Metamorphoses. And Ovid not only inserts Philomela's beautiful tapestry illustrating her story, but also incorporates her lengthy speech expressing her anger and anguish. Ovid's Philomela's speech enumerates Tereus' crimes. And he writes, "Oh, what a horrible thing you have done, barbarous, cruel wretch. Do you care nothing for my father's injunctions, his affectionate tears, my sister's love, my own virginity, the bonds of wedlock? You have confused all natural relations. I have become a concubine, my sister's rival, you a husband to both. Now Procne must be my enemy. Why do you not take my life, that no crime may be left undone, you traitor? Sooner or later, you shall pay dearly for this deed." Wilde's attunement to the Nightingale's interior motivations for becoming an aesthetic martyr in The Nightingale and the Rose is indebted to Ovid's version of the myth, where vengeance and a desire to mend the homosocial love between sisters motivates Philomela's creative expression. Wilde repurposes the Philomela myth to explore her psychological interiority and its expression through art. By the time that Wilde created his fairy tales in the 1880s, the genre had already begun reorienting itself to explore its characters' psychological intricacies. Dustin Friedman has argued that Wilde's aesthetics theory explores how the performativity of language can never fully articulate a self-consciously homoerotic subject. His reading of Mr. W.H. shows how Wilde's narrator explores not only the limits of language on the formation of the homoerotic subject, but also the potentiality of language to gesture towards aspects of subjectivity that lie beyond the linguistic realm. The non-linguistic birdsong of the metamorphosed Philomela became for Wilde another means through which to explore the limitations that language poses on the formation of the homoerotic subject. Wilde's story features an empathetic nightingale who sacrifices her life to create a red rose for an enamored student's beloved. The nightingale produces the red rose by sacrificing her life. She sings her beautiful songs while pressed against the thorn of a rose bush so intensely that it punctures her heart. The overjoyed scholar presents the rose to his beloved, who ultimately rejects him for another suitor who had offered her jewels. The nightingale's capacity to imagine a love that is only expressible beyond the limits of language are contrasted with the student's constriction within the linguistic realm. She promises the scholar a red rose, telling him that, quote, "I will build it out of music by moonlight and stain it with my own heart's blood," end quote. Her words are inarticulable to the student who, quote, "could not understand what the nightingale was saying to him, for he only knew the things that are written down in books," end quote. These books, the narrator tells us, are philosophical and metaphysical texts, not the mythical metamorphoses from which the nightingale springs. The Nightingale, by contrast, sings three songs whose transformative quality have a thematic similarity to Ovid's erotic epic. She sings first of the birth of love in the heart of a boy and a girl. She sings secondly of the birth of passion in the soul of a man and a maid. And she sings thirdly of the love that is perfected by death, of the love that dies not in the tomb. Her melodic trilogy imitates the framing narrative of Ovid's tales, where lovers tell other lovers myths. Its teleology enacts an erotic philosophy in which youthful adoration progresses to erotic passion before transcending into divine love. Embedded in this transformation is a metamorphosis from heterosexual love between a boy and a girl and a man and a maid into the ungendered, abstract concepts of love and death. This final song culminates in an eroticized rapture of the nightingale as the thorn penetrates her heart. By concluding with a song that subverts the former focus on heterosexual love to feature transcendental love, Wilde draws attention to the nightingale's origin story. Philomela and Procne both transform into the nightingale and the swallow, escaping sure death by Tereus, in order to live out their days in homosocial company. Wilde's fairy tale bears resemblance to his earlier poem for the ways that it focuses on a transformative story that features this transformation from heterosexual to same-sex love. And Wilde is making a distinction between these two loves, the latter of which the nightingale personifies as Eros. The nightingale promises the student a rose on the condition that, quote, "you will be a true lover," end quote. Omitting the girl entirely from her requisite, the nightingale creates an erotic dynamic between love and the student and situates them within Platonic terms. For love, she explains, quote, "is wiser than philosophy, though she is wise, and mightier than power, though he is mighty," end quote. She echoes Plato's Symposium by articulating the distinction Socrates' teacher Diotima makes between wisdom, power, and love. Diotima teaches Socrates to understand Platonic love as a spiritual power and a divine wisdom, an ascendance that begins with carnal same-sex attraction and transforms into an attraction of souls. Wilde's Nightingale continues to personify love in Platonic terms when she describes his physical characteristics. Quote, "flame-colored are his wings, and colored like flame is his body. His lips are sweet as honey, and his breath is like frankincense," end quote. The passage would have evoked for Wilde's late Victorian audience Benjamin Jowett's familiar translation of Plato's Phaedrus, which lingers over a description of a, quote, "winged Eros, the guardian of beautiful boys," end quote. In the Phaedrus, Socrates uses the metaphor of a man's erotic response to a beautiful youth to describe the interconnectedness between the body and soul. Wilde's flame-winged love echoes Jowett's translation. Jowett writes, "As he gazes on him, there is a sort of reaction, and the shudder naturally passes into an unusual heat and perspiration. For as he receives the effluence of beauty through the eyes, the wing moistens and he warms. And as he warms, the parts out of which the wing grew and which had been hitherto closed and rigid and had prevented the wing from shooting forth are melted." Wilde's Nightingale draws attention to love's lips and breath and describes his inflamed body and flame-colored wings. In this brief moment in the fairy tale, Wilde encodes love as queer, and he does so through the Nightingale Philomela. By focalizing homoerotic desire through the Nightingale's song, Wilde is exploring how non-linguistic aesthetic mediums might more freely articulate queerness than language itself. When Charles Robinson illustrated The Nightingale and the Rose in 1913, he perfectly captures Philomela's vision of the student as true lover to love. And he does so in two companion pieces that I'm about to show. In the first, "She will pass me by," the student's beloved passes by the student without noticing him. Her closed eyes and upturned face accentuate her disinterest. The student, with shoulder-length brunette hair and facial features resembling Wilde, watches with open eyes as she passes by. In the companion piece, "His lips are sweet as honey," an androgynous fleshy love is featured holding his hands to his heart. This Cupid figure glances slightly upward, as if looking past the woman up onto the balcony where the student returns his gaze. Robinson thus forges a connection between Wilde and the Nightingale's vision of the ideal lover that she wishes the student to embody. The earlier illustrator of Wilde's fairy tales also highlights the author's interest in exploring aesthetic mediums beyond language to express same-sex desire. When Walter Crane illustrated the first edition, he depicted the student as a classic reclining figure. The illustration subverts the male gaze by situating the Nightingale Philomela as subject and the student as object. Adorned with flowers and posed in a fainting posture, the student is the very image of an effeminate lover. The metamorphosed Philomela's gaze at the effeminate student insinuates a multitude of queer relationalities: lesbian desire, attraction to gender nonconforming figures, And perhaps also it's evocative of the male-male love that is featured throughout the collection. So Crane's front piece that I have here on the right draws attention to the connection between the homosocial lovebirds. We see two birds in the image, and male-male love. We see this group of semi-nude youth that are standing, gazing upon the nightingale and the swallow. And I think that it also speaks to Wilde's Happy Prince, that similarly features homoerotic love between the prince and the sparrow. The posture of Crane's student also resembles a well-known 2nd century AD Roman statue that the English collector Henry Blundell transformed from Hermaphroditus to a sleeping Venus and displayed in England throughout the 19th century. A critic writing around the same year that Wilde published his fairy tales described the statue's transformation in detail. Quote, "The figure was unnatural and very disgusting to sight, but by means of a little castration and cutting away the little brats crawling about its breasts, it became a sleeping Venus and as pleasing a figure as any," end quote. The statue's history elucidates 19th century transphobic attitudes regarding sexual and gender difference, in distinction to their celebratory treatment in Greco-Roman myth from which it derived. The student, like the statue, lies in a languid pose with his mouth agape. Crane adds the detail of the student's arm draped over his forehead, amplifying his femininity, and includes a sword to signify his castration. Crane's allusion to the Hermaphroditus Venus statue in his depiction of the modern student serves to emphasize the ways that Wilde's work positively depicted same-sex desire between men, as well as other queer and trans representations. By recuperating this reception history, Crane and Wilde draw attention to the ways that embracing and repurposing Ovidian mythology can help queer artists articulate their identities beyond modern sexual discourse. The non-linguistic birdsong of the nightingale, who attempts to teach the student to embrace love, prefigures the modern aesthete who explores queer desire through multiple aesthetic mediums. Like Orpheus's translation of Philomela's song in the Burden of Itys, both are didactic texts that impart the wisdom of queer love using linguistic as well as non-linguistic forms. Okay, part 3. On May 26th of 1901, Michael Field, Catherine Bradley, and Edith Cooper created a dramatic trilogy, a tripartite dramatic monologue that adapted the Philomela myth in ways that eroticized feminist sisterhood. Their version of the myth is indebted to Wilde's earlier experimental queer adaptation. Like Wilde, Michael Field revitalizes the interpersonal dynamics between Philomela, Procne, Itys, and Tereus in order to critique heteropatriarchal violence and celebrate same-sex love. And like Wilde, Michael Field explores the metamorphoses of sexual orientation and kinship bonds. Michael Field retells the Philomela myth as a homosocial communion between sisters, a version of womanhood that challenges the centrality of heterosexual marriage to modern society. The opening lines make Procne and Philomela's privileging of homosocial kinship bonds over exogamous heteroreproductive ones immediately apparent. The lyric sequence begins with Procne demanding that Tereus retrieve Philomela and bring her to Thrace. Tereus, go fetch my sister from her home. I cannot longer live without her voice. Her peplos folds, her fleeting through the door. Go, ah, I breathe more freely, he is gone. The imperative command, go fetch, highlights the discord Procne feels regarding her marriage. Procne is as dismissive of her husband as she is frank about her desire for Philomela. As she conjures a memory of her pre-married life in Athens, her speech trails off from a direct address to her husband as if she has forgotten his presence entirely. Transported into her daydream, she imagines Philomela's voice as she flounces through the doorway. She admires her peplos, a Greek dress, as it clings and folds against her body as she moves. Here, Michael Field transposes Ovid's Tereus's predatory gaze as he first lays eyes on Philomela onto Procne's homoerotic admiring gaze. Philomela swiftly passes into her mind as Tereus exits the scene in a sensual, vocal, moving image already imprinted on her mind. In the following lines, Michael Field describes the two sisters experiencing loneliness since they were separated in adulthood. And now I shall lose vision of the house at Athens, of the lonely weaving there since our rent sisterhood, the lonely night since I was ravaged to my marriage bed, the secret incommunicable hours. I am a stranger, am I not a slave to this dull son of Ares? Michael Field highlights the sisters' mutual loneliness in a manner that counterintuitively conjures up Philomela's presence at Tereus's absence. The spatial and temporal distance between them is simultaneously increased and diminished as Procne strains her mind to imagine her sister at her side. Procne willfully represses the painful vision of Philomela's lonely weaving at home in Athens, a vision of solitary loneliness she engages alongside her own experience of lonely nights in matrimonial company. Through the image of our rent sisterhood, Michael Field meditates on the broken bonds of sisterhood exogamy necessitates. Procne provides a critique of marriage within these first lines, implicitly aligning marriage with other forms of heteropatriarchal violence, all of which Tereus will commit against Philomela. The line, I was ravaged to my marriage bed, describes the Roman tradition of the bridegroom reenacting the rape of the Sabines. Michael Field also embeds within Procne's description of marital sex allusions to Philomela's rape and mutilation. The two share the experience of, quote, secret incommunicable hours, end quote. They also transpose the language Ovid uses to describe rape, rapere, to rape or to ravish, onto Procne's characterization of her marriage. She views herself as a slave captured by this dull son of Ares, the god of war, in a similar manner to the Trojan women enslaved as concubines. Procne characterizes heteropatriarchy as a system that forcibly silences women before proceeding to offer feminist sisterhood as an alternative model, bolstering women's agency and passions. This is in itself a radical version of feminist sisterhood by Victorian standards, yet Michael Field continues to elaborate the myth in even more provocative ways. The Secret Incommunicable Hours denounces heterosexual violence while also offering alternative queer possibilities. Michael Field is using late Victorian queer discourse to describe language, to describe desire using the language of subterfuge in a similar manner to Wilde and Douglas's, quote, love that dare not speak its name, end quote. These secret incommunicable hours evocatively foreshadows the poem's turn, wherein the two women lay in a romantic embrace. Procne stresses the intimacy of the homosocial bond between women, whose two songs merge into one, much like Bradley and Cooper's own united voice as Michael Field. They write, as two birds that warble to one another through the trees, our bosoms rose and fell. We had one song, and sometimes uttering, sometimes hearkening, a harmony grew up beside our thoughts. In this simile of shared communication, a unity of language and thought emerges. Procne allegorizes the transformation of the sisters' relationship through the depiction of their metamorphosis into a mating pair of songbirds. In the turn of the poem, Michael Field literalizes their symbolic unity. Procne begins with a feminist correction to the myth. She writes, quote, men fable I am pining for my home when Itys wearies me, and all this kingdom of Thrace is horrid to me as the woods. It is not Athens I desire, O child, thyself, thy small rose body in my arms, thy mutterings and thy fondness over me, thy breath in waking and thy breath asleep. Procne fleshes out the imagery of the sisters as birds whose bosoms rose and fell in song into an image of a woman embracing her beloved. The repetition of rose evokes eroticism between Wilde's Nightingale and the rose, and rose symbolism also appears in Michael Field's autobiographical writing as a symbol of same-sex love. In a 1901 diary entry, for instance, Bradley writes, quote, "I feel the softness of the dear poet's kiss, like the last petals of a passionate rose on one's lips," end quote. Here she's talking about the poet is Cooper, her co-author. And like this autobiographical description, Procne makes visible the physical erotic aspect of same-sex love between women. In the poem, Procne delineates her song's connection to love poetry by apostrophizing Philomela. "It is not Athens I desire, O child, thyself." In this moment, past memories dissipate as Procne seemingly successfully evokes an alternative present with Philomela at her side. Here, Procne transitions from into the more intimate second person address, formally slipping into the intimate love poetry language. Philomela and Procne transition from kin to lovers, yet rather than denounce their past, they affirm it when Procne endearingly calls Philomela child, acknowledging their shared childhood. By the beginning of the second poem, Michael Field's radical elaboration of traditional love poetry becomes clearer. The two poems are dialectic, enabling both lovers the agency to express themselves. The poem Philomela begins with a solitary Philomela addressing the absent Procne. Quote, "Sweet is the way to the fountain on shady hillside. Glad is the breaking of dawn on the dew of dewdrops. Show us the face that is bearing me, Procne, to thee." Philomela visits a fountain on shady hillside as she waits for Tereus' arrival to bring her back to Thrace to visit her sister. As she gazes into the fountain, Philomela willfully misrecognizes her own reflection for that of her sister. The moment evokes Wilde's narcissist in the Burden of Itys, who woos and kisses his own image. And Philomela's fountain reflects the image of Procne back to her in a poetic sentiment that encompasses their unity. The remainder of the poem retells the story of Philomela's plight while foreshadowing her transformation into a songbird. She writes, "Procne I sing in my heart, but her name I say not. Only from depths of a well or from earth's mid-hollow, hidden from sight with the leaves of the vines and laurel, baffling the ear with a chorus of feathered songsters, could I invoke the delights that in tumult haunt me. One and for one, and of one is the love that wrings me." Philomela echoes Procne's language of subterfuge to describe same-sex love. She sings Procne's name in her heart, yet censors herself from vocalizing her delights and love in human language, instead turning to the non-linguistic realm of birdsong to express herself. Written after Oscar Wilde's trial, where queer encoded language became evidence of one's homosexuality, Michael Field employs Wilde's earlier experimental translations of Philomela's song as an alternative metamorphic poetics through which to express queerness outside of language. The transformative bond between women that Michael Field creates in their Philomela poems is highly indebted to Wilde's earlier adaptations. Their version of Philomela and Procne creates a Greco-Roman origin myth for same-sex desire between adult women in a similar manner to Wilde's Orpheus and Itys. For both Michael Field and Wilde, the Philomela myth became a companion to Orpheus's origin story about discovering one's homoerotic sexual orientation in adulthood, from transitioning from heterosexual marriage into a homosocial bond between men or women. This focus on the interconnectedness between Philomela and other Ovidian figures shows how Wilde and Field were concerned with more than just individual subjectivity. They were interested in envisioning their own aesthetic circle as part of a genealogy that linked their role as modern artists to the fabled artists of classical mythology, specifically, I think Roman mythology because of the link with Ovid. They were also interested in strengthening bonds between modern artists through collaborations that they figured as kinship bonds that figured themselves as brotherhoods and sisterhoods within this queer community. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tara. That was just terrific. Just in case my internet connection it's a little unstable. If I go black, I'm still here, but it's just so that you can hear me. That was really wonderful. So thank you so much. And I'm sure that there are many questions. So to proceed for the questions, one of the things that I'm going to ask people to do is to put your name in the chat, and then I'll call on you there. It's just a little bit easier to see people than with the raised hands. But if you raised your hand, I will also, of course, call on you there to pose a question or any comments for Tara as well. Helen.
Tara, that was so wonderful. I really loved it. And I love what you were doing with the poems and with Ovid, who I've thought a lot about over the years. And I guess I just have two smaller questions, but it'll help me to tease out some of the different strands of your talk. So the first one was about the way that visual art kind of complements Wilde's poetry and is a medium where certain things can be expressed that cannot be said in words. And when you were showing that hermaphrodite statue and that really shocking commentary on it, I was thinking about the Shelley Memorial at Oxford. And I was wondering if, I mean, it seems clear there's a connection there. And I was just sort of browsing while I was listening to you, and then I see there's been some work on that statue in relation to classical sculpture, and so I was wondering if you had any thoughts about the figure of Shelley as maybe kind of, or the way that other Romantic poets, earlier poets, get rehabilitated in a queer way, if that interests you. So that was my first question. And then the second one was about the allusion to Venus in the Itys passage that you quoted, where he says he will take Venus to see the dying Adonis, that there is this sort of identification with her as the sort of goddess of love. And I was wondering about that, because that seemed an interesting gendering as well, or a way that gender gets even more complicated in that passage that you were reading so well. So two questions.
Great, thank you. For the first, it's been the third part of this talk is work that I began my dissertation work on, and then the Wilde stuff is relatively new. So I would have to go back and revisit some of my past work and writing on the Romantics, but I hadn't realized that there was a connection between that people have been working on and writing about the Shelley Memorial. So I'll definitely have to revisit that. So thank you so much for that suggestion. For the passage where Wilde is writing about this sort of identification with Venus as well, I really love this passage as a way, the way that I was reading it was, there's a similarity between Sappho's hymn to Aphrodite in the sort of relationship that Sappho has to Venus is sort of similar to the relationship as it appears in the poem, where Wilde is really comforting Venus after the death of Adonis. And so I think the comparison perhaps is more homoerotic than maybe a gender inversion, but it's something that I'm definitely interested in exploring, especially in comparison with Sappho 1, which I have actually discovered that Michael Field translated that poem as well. And so So that's definitely something that I wasn't able to talk about in the talk, but that I definitely am interested in exploring further.
That's fabulous. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Terrific. If I could just add something there, I was really struck by the illustration, by Crane's illustration about the relationship also to Botticelli's Mars and Venus, which would have just arrived in the National Gallery. And there's something about that, the pose and also the landscape and some of the things that you're thinking about, the kind of transversion process of that. It just might be also interesting. The horizontal format as well. It would have been an important picture at the moment. So, so the next person is Yvonne Ivory.
Hi, thank you, Tara, for a lovely Friday afternoon talk. My comment is that I'm not sure that you might be aware of another place that Wilde brings up this myth, and that is in one of the fragments that hasn't really been published, that would have been from the missing first scene of a Florentine tragedy. And you can find it in, I think it's in the appendix of Guy and Small's Studying Oscar Wilde, these kind of draft scenes. And I think it will fit into your analysis, because even though it's used in the setting of kind of an illicit love affair between a man and a woman, the image is used as the image of the kind of love that's going to be rejected in order for these two people to get together. So I think it might be a useful thing for you to look at. But my question is more about sticking with the Romantics, actually. I was wondering whether you had any thoughts on the contribution that Keats and Keats' Ode on a Nightingale might have made for Wilde. I mean, Wilde is a fanboy, I think, when it comes to Keats, and he writes, his sonnet on visiting the grave of Keats, and I think he's often thinking about and sometimes even channeling Keats. So I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, there's definitely, I just threw out the entire Burden of Itys, and of course I only kind of focused on a very small part, but he's definitely sort of working with, there are definitely resonances of Keats here. Yeah, it's something that I need to think more about. I haven't really been engaging with the Romantics for thinking about Wilde as much as I have with the Philomela of Michael Field, but I'll definitely keep it in mind, especially thinking about the Burden of Itys in those connections. Thank you.
Thank you. The next person who has a question is Jill Annan. I don't know if I said Enan, thank you. I was going to ask.
Everyone has trouble with it. Well, thank you, Tara. That was simply lovely and interesting and wonderful. And thank you also for calling my attention to some Michael Field poems that I was not familiar with. And you did a really great job with the close reading of those. But I have some just really practical questions as you were reading. Since I wasn't familiar with the poem, I got my trusty catalog, the Ivor Treby catalog, and so I was looking up 1901, and he writes that Michael writes the Sonata Philomela. So I was wondering, first of all, are those two poems the entirety? Are there more? Were those excerpts, or was that just it? And then also, was it just sort of, his own sort of oddities that made him call it a Sonata Philomela, or is that what they called it? Or is there more that you'd like to say about music other than the bird song? I'd love to hear you talk about all of those things.
Sure. So I discovered these just by random looking at Sight and Song in their poetry journals at the Bodleian Library in 2013, 2014. And since then, I've been able to look at the British Library manuscripts of their autobiography. So in the autobiography, they call the Philomela trilogy a sonata. They do not call it that in the manuscripts at the Bodleian. So it's unpublished. Trevi never decided not to publish it, although I'm sure that he was familiar with it from the work that he did at the Bodleian. So before I had sort of just noticed the quality of kind of the dramatic monologue or trialogue in the poems, and so I was surprised by the fact that Michael Field referred to it as a sonata in the diaries, and it's something that I'm really interested in researching further. But I really haven't had the opportunity to yet.
Thanks. It's so interesting how you can read the diaries in the archive and completely ignore something that later on you might become interested in, right? So, because I've read those bits, but it didn't register. So thanks for bringing that to our attention.
Yeah. And I should add, one of the interesting things, and they don't spend a lot of time writing about these poems in the diaries, but one interesting thing is that in the 2 sentences where they sort of summarize their work in progress, Philomela, they do emphasize that they're really interested in focusing on the love between sisters. So, and then also, I think you were asking about the length of the poems. The Procne and Philomela, I included the entire poems there. There is another poem, Tereus, and that is the most extensive poem out of the trilogy. It's also very interesting because Tereus in the end becomes very regretful of his behavior. And that poem is also interesting because it sort of creates a poetic tapestry that encompasses Philomela's story within the web that Arachne weaves in the Metamorphoses. And I'm happy to share this work with whoever's interested. I have the entire poems transcribed.
Terrific, thank you. Maybe while people are thinking of questions, I could ask you something in light of your being the inaugural Kenneth Karmiole Fellowship holder, because I was thinking it would be, it may be very interesting for people to think about you undertaking this when you weren't actually able to access the library in person. And I understand that you've been working with them in the library, and maybe you could just say a little bit about the kind of hurdles and some of the things that you might have encountered there.
Sure. So I was lucky enough to attend and present at the Curiosity and Desire conference at the Clark a few years back. And I have a sister that lives in LA, and so I've spent a little tiny bit of time working in the Clark before, and I just knew that the archivists there were very familiar with the Wilde collection and would be able to really help me out as I navigated trying to conduct this research from Santa Cruz. And so Scott Jacobs was really wonderful about holding up first editions of certain books that I was working on and flipping through, trying to help me find the passages that I was interested in. He scanned several different books for me and made recommendations about other things that I might be interested in. I think I was already familiar enough with the Clark archive that it made it quite a bit easier for me, but it was a challenge. And I am so lucky that I have gotten to visit in the past. My week-long research trip in 2018 kind of inspired this research. I remember seeing a grasshopper on a rose outside in the Clark grounds, and that gave me the idea of working on the Nightingale and the Rose, looking at the frescoes at the Clark. It's just these lovely frescoes of kind of homoerotic depictions of Greco-Roman myth kind of inspired me to really take this project seriously. So
that's terrific. Thank you. It was something when you're talking about Scott holding up the books, there's also something about the scale. Like I feel like there's some way that actually seeing somebody using it is it somehow helps with the materiality of the artifact that we don't always have access to. So thank you very much for that. Does anyone have any questions about Tara's talk? Any further comments? No, all right. Then I think we can thank you very much once again, Tara, Dr. Thomas, for a really inspiring presentation, and also the way that you read the poems was really marvelous. So thank you very much for sharing your scholarship with us. It was great.
Thank you.
Also, thanks to Ken Karmiole for the fellowship, for the talk, and also for being here. It's wonderful that you could join us, and I look forward to meeting you in person. And to the rest of you all for participating. We look forward to the next opportunity. Thanks again, Tara.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.